Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Wednesday, January the 7th. We are two big strides further towards working out the shape of a peace deal for Ukraine, with Keir Starmer sketching out what British troops might actually do on the ground inside that country. But could we soon have to protect Greenland as well? My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Last night, the US went further than ever before, spelling out what its own commitment to keeping the peace in Ukraine might look like in future. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who was in Paris yesterday, said the US was prepared to sign up to protocols that would both deter and defend Ukraine from future attacks. That's new language, further than some ever thought was possible. But it's still a slow-moving chess game. We now await the reactions of President Putin and in turn then how President Trump responds to that.
It's also a big move from Britain. It puts us in the frame as one of the main guarantors for peace on the ground in Ukraine, if indeed that deal finally comes to fruition. It's bound to come up at the first Prime Minister's questions of 2026 today. So it's our top story this morning. But there's a lot going on domestically as well, Sam.
Including the politics of the new safety strategy for roads, which is released mid-morning this morning. And there's a lot of politics in it. And also, I've got an exclusive which I'm running out on Sky today, which I'm very excited to tell you about. It's an angry row between government and MPs because, get this, Anne, the number of written questions submitted by MPs and peers doubled in a year last year in 2025 compared to 2024. And government thinks MPs are getting AI to write their questions. Not everyone accepts that. Right. So I do also want to give a shameless plug. Please do vote for us in the Political Podcast Awards, the People's Choice category. Just Google it and look for Sam and Anne there.
Yes, if you do think that we keep you ahead of the curve every morning, as we hope we do, please tick our box on the website against all of those other trivial fellow contenders in podcast world. The link is also in the show notes. Quite a lot of what we were talking about together makes the morning papers today, so we do aim to give you stuff to get ahead of the agenda. And now that I promised that, Sam, I suppose we better deliver some. What have you got?
Well, we were talking yesterday about the business rates hike, which comes into force next year after this year's reevaluation, which particularly hits hard the hospitality industry. And there's a lot about that in the papers, the Times suggesting 24 Labour MPs will revolt. I heard the industry plans to use the World Cup, which apparently is a football tournament in June, according to Google, as a moment to press its case.
I like that Sam has to use AI to find out when the World Cup might be occurring. But Sam, you did tell us exclusively, perhaps more in your field of expertise, about the pushback that was happening on business rates. Another cost whammy coming down the line is the fuel duty cut worth 5p, scheduled to expire in September rather than the budget, and that's an unusual moment for a cliff edge. Well, today we learn that Nigel Farage will use that policy to counteract the government's cost of living campaign, saying it's a declaration of war on motorists. It'll push up inflation. So you can feel battle being joined there on Cossie Lives and who is going to control that part of the political argument.
Big reform press conference this afternoon. But let's start with what Britain has and hasn't promised for Ukraine. Here's what Keir Starmer was part of last night and the deal that he signed up in front of the cameras sitting next to President Macron and President Zelensky. So Britain and France become the first and only so far allies to explicitly sign up to a coalition of the willing troop plan for post-ceasefire Ukraine. And that's the first important point, right? Nothing kicks in until there's a deal. And we're still a few hard yards away from a deal, particularly given that we don't yet know President Putin's reaction to any of this.
That's true, but just let's keep our mind on really what this would mean in terms of a British deployment, in terms of a deal if it goes ahead. It really means that this minute planning, and we talked about it a bit in the special that we had out just before the new year, Sam, this minute planning by the MOD and the armed forces has to be at a point when it's really ready to go if and when a deal is signed. So planning is actually quite advanced militarily, and I'm not sure that that's yet entirely come through to the British public. So I think we'll start to see a bigger debate about that now. So what does it mean? Well, the Ukrainian army would be responsible for defending the front line with Russia. That's important. I think that's intended also as a reassurance point. This is not intended. There will be fears about British soldiers being put in harm's way, so that the front line remains the business of Ukraine to defend. Britain and France would establish military hubs across Ukraine, which is to say, strategically important places, but away from the line of contact and potential front lines, to enable the deployment and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment, effectively being a support force there for Ukraine's defensive needs. But no doubt about it, it would, if it came to pass, involve Britain and France as the two countries who've signed up at the moment to being closer to the theatre of potential warfare.
So troops on the ground, not on the front line, providing reconstruction and troop training and some defence of weaponry and training around weaponry. Now, a lot of the rest of it is shrouded in secrecy, but we're grateful just for those details alone. Emmanuel Macron actually went on telly last night, French telly, after all the ceremony was done, to said that he was willing to provide thousands of troops. Now, Keir Starmer didn't explicitly match a number. I'm sure he'll be pressed in the Commons at Prime Minister's Questions today on that. British Army not in a sort of particularly expansive state at the moment. So all deployments are controversial because we don't have many troops to spare. But will he go anything like towards matching the French president on that? The German Chancellor didn't even go as far as either the UK or France. He didn't make a firm troop commitment, which is why the documents refer to the UK, France and allies. But Merz did signal that Germany is ready to contribute troops for a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine once a ceasefire has been sealed with Russia. Slightly watered down commitment from them, therefore. Right. And as you rightly say, you actually knew that the detail of this plan was much more advanced than many people, including me, realised in our New Year special. So kudos to that. But more generally, just give me the big picture take on where you think that leaves us, because it's so important for Britain.
I think what's particularly important in the way this plan is being put together by John Healey, MOD, top officials in the armed forces, the top brass there, is that it has to be focused on being potentially a de-escalation focused mission. Because one of the big fears, of course, and there's people have said this from the start who are sceptical of British involvement and Western involvement in Ukraine, is, well, what if you make things worse? I think the argument now is, well, if we get to this ceasefire, that's plainly something that would be a good thing overall. But how do you then stop? Everyone who's dealt with the Russians on this has probably heard this fear before, that there are triggers. You can create triggers to adverse events, attacks or false flag events that would sort of kick off the war again. And at that point, you'd have French and British troops in Ukraine. So in terms of trying to avoid that happening, you need the best possible intelligence guarantees, you need monitoring, you need verification, and you need a step-by-step plan as to what would happen. If X happens, what follows as Y. Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, saying most of the sticking points around that have been agreed. But what does the US actually bring to this scenario, Sam? I think this is going to be really quite interesting when you come to looking at the old Soviet joke, who's bringing the ham and who's just bringing the eggs when it comes to this particular repast. And monitoring, verification, and US forces supporting, note the language, others who are part of a force on the ground. Sounds like the US is really one or two steps back from where France and the UK would be here. So they would be providing muscle and intelligence and backing and logistics. A deterrence, yes, but they're not saying what they would do if it all happened to kick off again. How does Russia react? That's a big question. Keir Starmer raised that yesterday. The ball is now in Putin's court. Kremlin communications, I took a look at the Kremlin website. Russian Christmas being celebrated. Putin flanked by a very senior military figure, massive amounts of medals on his chest, talking about the Orthodox Church supporting participants of the special military operation, i.e. code for the war, and choosing a church of St. George the Victorious. So we don't know what Putin will say yet, but he certainly intends to present it as victory on his terms.
I think in that answer, and you showed that you bring the ham. So let me just bring some eggs very quickly. All of this is happening in the context also of what's going on with Greenland. I just want to make one point. The Wall Street Journal on Monday night was reporting that for all of the rhetoric about a forcible takeover of the Denmark overseen territory, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was telling colleagues on Monday night that the goal is to buy the territory from Denmark in the first instance. Now, that won't allay many fears, and that story will rumble on because of comments by the White House press secretary and others, but that seems to be at the moment where we are on that. But let's turn to domestic news. And the government publishes all sorts of strategies the whole time. And often I think these impinge on people's lives more than politicians really realise. It's the kind of thing that directly changes Britain's and the public's kind of view of the state, because the government makes sweeping decisions for the greater good, but it does actually have a direct impact on day-to-day living. And I think that's going to be true of the road safety strategy, which is published by Heidi Alexander, the Transport Secretary, mid-morning. Now, it might not sound in the first instance political, but there are all sorts of areas of intervention that could change how drivers go about doing their business. So I find this stuff absolutely fascinating about whether, in the end, the public think that politicians get the balance right here.
And the justification is set out at the start of the strategy, isn't it? Both of us took a look at that. Over the past decade, it says 22 European countries have made more progress than the UK in reducing road fatalities, causing Britain to slip from third to fourth in the road safety rankings of the continent. We've had a decent record on road safety, Sam, slipping one place in the league table to justify a pretty wide-ranging shift in strategy and some more draconian moves, which we could just discuss quickly in a moment. I mean, what do you make of that?
I mean, slipping from third to fourth is in a kind of league table of multi-dozen numbers of countries doesn't feel like a crisis that can be used to prompt something major. But I've got to note that, preventing road deaths is an obvious, clear goal. The government has stepped in previously to do it to quite good effect. And so, I mean, it's not for me to judge whether the balance is right, but I find this stuff fascinating, and about whether or not people are aggravated by these kinds of things or cheer them or even notice. Right, what does it involve? Well, you've probably already heard that they're consulting on cutting the drink drive limit, so it would be unwise even to have one pint or any wine if you're in a pub. Nigel Farage has jumped on the back of that, so have some pub groups warning about the impact on rural pubs. But there's so much more to it, right? The strategy mandates 18 new vehicle safety technologies, including anti-braking and lane keeping assistance, right? So that's a massive deal for the car industry. If all new cars sold must have that technology. If you think of the fuss kicked up around the sort of green changes to electric vehicles, mandates on cars are a big political thing for the car industry. So keep an eye on that. Right. Another thing. It floats a new minimum learning period of between 3 and 6 months. So basically delaying when 17-year-olds can kind of properly get behind the wheel without an adult sitting next to them, right? At 17, young people have already been able to vote for a year. This is another sort of infringement on their liberty / very sensible move for people who aren't quite ready to drive. So that'll be quite a big deal. Other things, right? There's a government consultation on the use of what they call preventative technology, such as alcohol interlock devices. Now, those of you who watch Pluribus on Apple TV over the festive period will know that's the thing that you breathe into in order to check that you haven't got alcohol in your blood that's sort of hardwired into your car. And if there is alcohol in your blood, the car won't start. Now, at the moment, UK courts can't force that on people, but will this consultation change that? And will we all be breathing into our cars in future? That's a big change. And this is another big one that will have a bleed across onto growth. There's an interesting line in the strategy about consulting on reforms to motorcycle training, testing and licensing. Look, this is all about, kind of delivery companies, isn't it? We've seen appalling driving by motorcyclists as they speed to get your almost piping hot food to you. But if you put lots of burdens and regulations on those, is the cost of your delivery about to go up? Nothing is ever quite cost-free in this space. And so to treat it like a kind of tablet of stone, I think this is highly political.
There's lots of trailing wires in that already. I would just throw in being a sort of girl from the boondocks of a rural county Durham. Is the response going to be rather different, particularly on that quite strict drink driving proposal of reducing, as you say, to the point where you'd be unwise to have anything to drink, even half a pint, and particularly if you're sort of lighter body weight, women and men metabolizing differently, etc. That often lands symbolically quite badly in rural communities, even among people who would want to be responsible about what they drink, but sort of feel it's that kind of urban imposition on rural social life, etc.
Can I also just make the point, Anne? I think that everybody I know would say, I am a terrible driver. But there's not a single thing in this that would particularly improve my use on the road. So I'll put my hands up. None of my family, friends or colleagues who have ever been in a car with me particularly enjoys the experience. But no bit of that document looks like it's addressed at me.
Mind you, I've seen you on a Lime bike, so it's kind of all relative. Just a fun fact. This does lean on Vision Zero strategic approach to eliminating road deaths that a lot of very successful countries at that, mainly the Nordics, also the Netherlands, have had great success with. But must be said, for instance, if you look to Norway, they have formal targets of 0 deaths, in that case by 2050. So they're making quite iron commitments. I don't know whether this strategy goes that far, Sam.
It doesn't quite. That the UK plan suggests that they want to cut road deaths by 65% by 2035. So there isn't a zero strategy there, but we will see. Right, let's move on. I've got a story that's running out on Sky all day that I think is a bit of a talker, quite frankly. Right. So, as I mentioned at the top, in 2025, the number of written questions submitted by MPs and peers basically doubled from 49,000 to basically 90,000. Many of our biggest Whitehall departments all of a sudden are having to answer twice as many written questions from our parliamentary friends as they did the year before. And this is sort of, according to government figures, gumming up the system. Now, parliamentary questions can be answered fairly straightforwardly by civil servants. There are officials whose job it is to do that. But they can be quite complicated things, costing up to 850 a piece. And what's going on is that government sources, in pretty punchy language, have been saying to me, look, some of these questions are so obscure or so generic that we keep wondering whether basically some MPs are getting AI to write them in bulk, or getting their parliamentary teams to write them in bulk. Now, I think this launches a really big, interesting conversation about the use of AI. I talk to people all over the place about how suddenly the amount of correspondence, if you're in a council legal office or you're in a part of government, has gone through the roof because everyone's getting AI to draft everything, and it makes life more complicated. Now, obviously, Whitehall departments are also using AI in some of the responses, but nevertheless, it's suddenly causing a very big burden. Great talker. Is it right that MPs' offices should use AI to draft this stuff? Important to say, not a single MP coughed when I spoke to them on and off the record to using AI in their questions. They say they don't do that. But nevertheless, that's what government sources are alleging. What do you make of all of this?
It reminds me, Sam, of when some of my kids first went to university and they were told they must never use AI under any circumstances. They would be booted out, saving their parents money in student fees, only to find about 3 years down the line, that they're all asking whether I can just get them the latest update for ChatGPT or any other available service. And I wonder whether this is inevitable, but that we just, until this very good story, hadn't thought about the consequences. Of course, people are going to use AI to frame questions in the same way that journalists are doing it more and more, lawyers are doing it more, everybody is doing it more and more. The point is, will the government then start to respond in AI? Will there be a kind of race in terms of AI happening there, in terms of that huge volume of questions? She says putting massive pressure on the system. Well, what's source for the goose is source for the gander. I think in the end, to me, it feels inevitable that MPs are going to use AI, and probably so will the response. But tell me if I'm just being a bit, techno-cynical.
No, I think the whole question is, are MPs ultimately being reckless by simply flooding the zone with parliamentary questions?
Fair point.
There is a cap of 20 a day, and the procedure committee is looking at maybe changing that cap. So I think this will feed into that. But I think that the use of AI to sharpen people's questions, but also increase the volume and the complexity of them, is a real phenomena that the whole of the public sector and other places are having to deal with. Right. Volume. Too much. That's what's happened to us with this morning's podcast. We've bust through 20 minutes again, so we're going to have to bring it to a dramatic close. Thank you very much indeed for being here for Wednesday's Politics at Sam and Anne. I'll be back tomorrow.
We are at the moment AI free, but they're in person.